Hi guys, and welcome to another episode of Kabir Considers. In this video, I'm going to react to the real reason why the US has 11 aircraft carriers. Now, from what I understand, I would imagine the answer is because the US is effectively the world's police, and having all these carriers means that you can deploy planes, troops, pretty much, within an hour or so, if the carrier is in a close proximity of where it needs to be. That power projection is a very, very powerful weapon. It kind of cements America's status really as a superpower, but there might be ulterior reasons, like additional reasons, maybe, I don't know, in terms of military strategy, or I don't know, potentially use of personnel or training. I don't know. Like, it should be a really interesting video. I really dig these kind of military videos. They're really, really interesting. Let's do it.
Aircraft carriers are so important to the US government that there is a federal law mandating the minimum number of operational carriers that the US Navy must have.
Really?
That number is 11. But how did they come up with this number? And why is there so much emphasis on aircraft carriers and not on other types of ships? The number of aircraft carriers, the size of the US Navy, and the size of the US military as a whole all follow a simple formula that's based on two major wars. But it's not what you think.
Oh yeah, isn't there that policy that the US military should be able to fight two major wars at the same time at any given moment? Could that be the answer?
Being the most powerful is not the same thing as being powerful enough. You often hear that the United States has the largest and most powerful navy in the world, but just being number one is not necessarily sufficient. Just like how any MMA champion would be overwhelmed if they face multiple opponents at once, the most powerful military may also not be able to defeat the combined forces of multiple nations. So the question is, how much power is enough? The United States military doctrine is based around power projection. Power projection, simply put, is the ability of a country to deploy and sustain forces outside of their territory. To accommodate this, there are currently about 750 US foreign military bases spread across 80 nations around the world.
Wow. I mean, just the cost of upkeep and running those bases must be so huge. I guess that's why the military budget for the States, I think last year, it topped $1 trillion, didn't it? Whew.
But the United States' primary means of power projection, especially where permanent basing is limited, is the Navy. And this is precisely why there is so much emphasis on aircraft carriers. Where is the closest aircraft carrier? They say that's the first question that US presidents ask at the time of a crisis. But it's really the air wing assigned to the aircraft carrier that the presidents are interested in. The carrier is just a floating airbase. The primary role of any aircraft carrier is to enable operation of the air wing that it carries. Kind of like how bread is just a vehicle for delivering butter.
Hey man, don't talk about bread like that. Bread is delicious.
And the true power projection that aircraft carriers are known for is really enabled by the airplanes in the carrier air wing, which can project tactical air power over long distances, including airborne early warning, air interdiction, and air-to-surface warfare. In fact, the same law that currently demands the US Navy to have a minimum of 11 aircraft carriers also requires a minimum of 9 carrier air wings. But how did the US government come up with the number 11? The US Navy's 11 supercarriers are more than all other nations' aircraft carriers combined, and that's just in quantity. Displacement aside, the American aircraft carriers are all nuclear-powered, giving them unlimited range. But not all 11 supercarriers are deployable simultaneously.
Has there ever been like a problem with the nuclear reactors on one of these carriers? Or do we know enough about how to maintain a nuclear core that there shouldn't be another Chernobyl type moment? Because that would be a complete disaster, wouldn't it? Imagine there's a nuclear meltdown on a carrier in the middle of the ocean, the fallout all seeping into the water.
At any given time, about a third are in maintenance yards dealing with upgrades and overhauls, a third are undergoing training and preparation, and a third are on deployment. Even though, if needed, more carriers could be rushed into deployment, the total number of deployable supercarriers is far from the nominal 11. In practice, 2 to 3 supercarriers are deployed at any given time, and that is enough. Enough to fight 2 wars in 2 separate regions of the world at once and decisively win both. Under President Lyndon B. Johnson, the U.S. Armed Forces were sized to be able to fight 2 wars at the same time. At some point, even a half-war was added to be fought in the Third World.
Wow.
When Nixon took office in 1969, the formula was changed to accommodate fighting 1.5 wars simultaneously. Each president after that somewhat modified this strategy, but the basic measure still seems to be defined as the ability to fight in 2 geographically separated regions of the world nearly simultaneously.
A bit off topic, guys, but have you guys been hearing about countries stopping using the US dollar, like or trading, buying oil using the US dollar? Like, is that been in the news in the US? Because that's quite a big story, isn't it? Because if the petrodollar isn't the default currency anymore, the demand for the US dollar is going to go down. No? And that in itself would devalue, like lower the value of the dollar because there's going to be less demand for it. Like, do you guys know much about that, or has the media been talking about other stories?
This is referred to as 2 major regional contingencies strategy or 2 major theater wars strategy. The ability to deter and defeat large-scale cross-border aggression in 2 distant theaters in overlapping timeframes is key for the United States to remain a global power and maintain its worldwide interests. The most recent example of this strategy in action is the 2 overlapping major wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. The Iraq War started in 2003, overthrowing Saddam Hussein, and the official withdrawal of US troops was completed in 2011. Although the mismanagement of the power vacuum following Saddam's demise gave prominence to ISIS in 2014, followed by the re-involvement of US troops. In parallel, the war in Afghanistan started in 2001 and went on for...
Wow, what the heck was that? What was that? Like...
War in Afghanistan started in 2001 and went on for 20 years.
What weapons were
those? In February
those?
of 2020, the US and Taliban signed an agreement in Qatar, where Taliban agreed to take unspecified action to prevent other groups, including Al-Qaeda, from using Afghan soil to threaten the US and its allies, in return for full withdrawal of all international forces from Afghanistan. By August 31, 2021, as the whole world was watching, the US and allied forces had hastily departed from Kabul, putting the Taliban back in control of the country. But this idea of fighting 2 wars at once goes back to the late 19th and early 20th century.
If we could go back in time to 2003, would you guys still be in support of going into Iraq and Afghanistan? Like, let me know your thoughts in the comments, just because, we all saw how that went down, and the unintended consequences of that, let me know what you guys think.
The late 19th century was a time of territorial expansion for the United States. In 1898 alone, the United States annexed Hawaii, acquired Guam and Puerto Rico, and purchased the Philippines from Spain for $20 million. With some of those islands being in the Pacific and the rest in the Atlantic, Navy presence was required in both oceans. The completion of the Panama Canal in 1914 allowed the crossing of ships from one side to the other, which meant the US Navy could be present in both oceans without having twice as many ships. But by the 1930s, with the rise of new regional powers to the west and the decline of the Royal Navy to protect the United States against threats from the east, it became necessary for defense planners to consider the possibility of confronting 2 threats simultaneously, from Germany on the east and from Japan on the west.
I see.
The result was the 1940 Vincent Walsh Act, also known as the Two-Ocean Navy Act, which funded a 70% increase in the size of the US Navy fleet.
And not only was this good from a strategic standpoint, but it's also great for, companies like Lockheed Martin and, all of the other contractors, because, someone's going to have to build those those carriers. It just means that they're going to make more money. Not saying it was purely a capitalist endeavor, but you have to believe that was an element in the decision making. I'm sure these companies probably lobbied the politicians who were responsible for making that decision.
This was the largest naval procurement bill in U.S. history, authorizing $8.5 billion at the time for a naval expansion program that put emphasis on aircraft and aircraft carriers. This resulted in the construction of 18 aircraft carriers and expansion of air and naval facilities across the Pacific. Now, it's one thing to come up with a concept or strategy, like one that allows for fighting and winning two major wars simultaneously. But it's a whole other thing to actually come up with the numbers. How many Army divisions, how many Air Force fighter wings, and how many Navy carrier strike groups are required to support such a strategy? And within each one, say the Navy, how many and what types of ships are exactly needed? The US Navy's goal is to reach 355 ships by 2034.
Wow.
Currently, they have 298, and at the rate that they're going, retiring 2-year-old ships, it's debatable that they'll hit that goal. Remember that aircraft carriers
Retiring 2-year-old ships? That can't be right.
are vulnerable on their own, which is why they never sail alone. A variety of ships are needed to support the carriers when deployed, which is why Navy ships like cruisers, destroyers, and at times submarines and supply ships accompany carriers in a formation known as a carrier strike group. But conservative public policy organizations, notably studies done by the Heritage Foundation, call for a much bigger military. For example, not a 355-ship Navy, but a 400-ship Navy.
But is this necessary though? Because this is all going to cost huge amounts of money. Money that could be spent on many other things, healthcare, infrastructure,
And not 11 aircraft carriers, but 13. 12 plus 1. The one accounts for a carrier that is almost always undergoing extensive midlife overhaul. The rationale for wanting the other 12 aircraft carriers is to maintain one aircraft carrier at each of the 3 major regions of the world: Atlantic, Pacific, and the Mediterranean/Middle East. Then to have 3 additional aircraft carriers for each carrier deployed. This is to ensure that the ships, the crew, and the aircraft on board can remain healthy and effective. Less ships could mean longer deployment times, which may not be operationally realistic.
It's a valid point, but I just don't know whether it's enough of a justification to sanction, tens of billions of dollars of additional expense. How do you guys feel about that? Does the military need to spend more money now? Or do you think, maybe that could be spent in other areas?
The 340-day deployment of USS Nimitz, which ended in March of 2021, was the longest deployment of any aircraft carrier since the Vietnam War. Even though the proponents of the 2 major theater wars strategy insist that no one has been able to come up with a better and more robust solution for sizing the US military, there are massive costs associated with maintaining and growing an even bigger military force.
Huge
Something
costs.
that has proven difficult, given that US military budget as a percentage of the GDP has been declining over the past few decades. In addition, other forms of threats like cyber warfare could throw a big wrench into the mix. Cyber attacks that can cause widespread disruption to communication systems in the United States, or even worse, in military command, control, and communication systems, could have devastating consequences to US national security.
Yeah, I think this is where the US, if they're going to spend more money, should. Things like AI, which is just accelerating rapidly now. I just think wars of the future, they're not always going to be fought like we see in Ukraine. There's going to be a lot of more cyber warfare, taking out critical infrastructure, like data centers, stuff like that.
The Navy Act of 1940 was written at a time when power projection required physical presence, aircraft carriers, and aviators. That's why we love Top Gun. But would a day come when Tom Cruise stars in Top Hack?
Great video, very, very interesting. As suspected, the primary reason for the need for that many carriers is a power projection, which, to be fair, is a justified cause for sure. I just don't know if, the US military needs to spend, more on like building another carrier. Like, what do you guys think? I'm sure a lot of you are more informed on this than I am, but I just think, war is evolving. Wars are becoming a lot less. They're moving away from the wars of old, where it's literally who has the bigger army. I think we need to think more in terms of technology now and innovation. Maybe investing more in like AI defense in particular. Like AI systems and algorithms are, like I mentioned in the video, they are really, really, like, the level of advancement is in the last few years. I've been watching this closely, has been huge. And this is just the stuff that we see, things like ChatGPT that have been released to the public. You can be sure that there are more advanced systems and algorithms that are being kept from the public, that are being used for, either military or adversarial reasons. That's where I think we need to focus on. Maybe less so on just, building more carriers and stuff like that, even though I know carriers are, very, very, very useful for sure. But yeah, maybe we need to kind of maybe think a little bit outside of the box. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you in the next one.